Jesus' arrest and the things that we're about to dive in today, something that we need to be clear of is that it was no surprise to Jesus. Jesus wasn't like, oh, I didn't see this coming. In no way, shape, or form did that happen. There are people that theorize about that, like, I wonder when Jesus was going to know this. But clearly, Jesus knew that this was coming. Jesus literally prophesied that these things would take place. Jesus first began, if you guys remember, when we were back in Mark 8 and 9 and 10, Jesus first began to tell the disciples about the things that were going to happen to him. In Mark 8, it says that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and the scribes. So he's prophesying that this council, called the Sanhedrin, which was if you will, a supreme court of about 70 men, 70 men, that was the Sanhedrin, and then the high priest would lead these 70 men in this council, like in this judgment hall. And that would take place in the temple. That's where it's supposed to take place. And he's prophesying that this group, the Sanhedrin, they're going to reject him. He's prophesying that he's going to suffer many things. In the next chapter, in Mark chapter 9, in verse 31, Jesus told the 12 disciples that the Son of Man is going to be delivered, that is, betrayed or handed over into the hands of men. And so once again, first he's prophesying about how he's going to be rejected by the Sanhedrin. He's talking about how he's going to then be arrested. And it's like, man, what are you talking about? And every time he mentions these things, like, what are you talking about? Like, we've seen the things that you can do in your teachings. Like, plus, you've never done anything wrong. Like, what are you talking about? In both those chapters, Jesus also mentioned that he would be killed and rise again. And we're going to address those prophecies in the next couple of weeks, or over the next couple of weeks. In the next chapter, in chapter 10, verse 33, Jesus brings both of his previous prophecies together and says very clearly that the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then will they hand him over to the Gentiles. So here, in this third prophecy, Jesus prophesied that he would be betrayed, that he would be arrested, and brought before the Sanhedrin, this council, and that they would find him to be worthy of the death penalty, and that they would then hand him over to the Gentiles, which in their context would have clearly meant the Romans. So here's Jesus, a couple of chapters earlier, and in the gospel narrative, multiple times before this happened, I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be condemned to death. I'm going to be handed over to the Romans. Now you might ask, and this is important, this will help us this morning, is that if they were going to do all that, right, this council was going to do all that, why would they have to bring him to the officials of Rome for? Well, that's because they themselves had no jurisdiction to execute the death penalty. It could get them in trouble. So they're like, let's make sure there's no loopholes in this, make sure no one can stop this. We're going to bring it to Rome. And being under Roman rule, they were going to have to convince Rome to give him the death penalty because they couldn't just do it themselves. Jesus prophesies about all of these things. And all of these things are exactly what happened next. So last week when Andrew was teaching, he thought about how Jesus was betrayed by Judas and how Jesus got arrested. And if you remember, Jesus did not resist arrest. Peter was ready. He chops off, the guy's ear like, I'm going to, no. Live by the sword, die by the sword, Peter. And Jesus does not resist arrest, even though he's done nothing wrong. Jesus has committed no violence, even though he had divine authority, if he wanted to stop that. Yet they chose to bind his hands as if he was going to run or be violent. Thank you. So he's not done anything violent. He's not resisted arrest. And they bind his hands together. Now, they initially are going to take Jesus to the former high priest. And we'll get to our text here in just a moment. I'm getting you to where we're going to be. If you look at the other Gospels, initially they take Jesus to the former high priest, That was the current high priest's father-in-law, whose name was Annas. And even though he was no longer the high priest, he was still highly respected and very influential. So once again, they're trying to make sure that everyone's on board with this. They want to make sure they can get a conviction. So the first they bring him to the former high priest, who apparently has more respect than the current high priest. My understanding is that it was Rome that kicked him out of that position, but highly respected. And the Bible teaches us that in the gospel, according to John, in chapter 18, here's what happens. So Jesus is bound, right? So this mob binds Jesus. They take him to the former high priest Annas' house, okay? And in chapter 18 of John, the high priest Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teachings. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus answered him. I have always taught in the synagogue and in the temple where all the Jews gather, and I haven't spoken anything in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who've heard what I told them. Look, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officials standing by slaps Jesus, saying, is this the way you answer the high priest? Keep in mind, he's not the high priest. He's the former high priest. If I have spoken wrongly, Jesus answered him, give evidence about the wrong. But if rightly, why did you hit me? This is a wild moment. He's arrested, no flight risk, not violent. He's standing there. So tell us about your disciples and your teachings. He's like, that's a goofy question. Ask my followers. And he gets slapped across the face for it. And then he's like, man, you better give a reason for slapping me in the face. They don't give him an answer for slapping him in the face. Jesus is simply telling this man and this mob, if you want to know what I taught, ask my followers, ask my disciples. In other words, Jesus is telling this former high priest to get real witnesses. If you're going to form a council against me, if you're going to bring the Sanhedrin together, at least get some witnesses together that can genuinely testify what I have taught. Then Jesus is swiftly and unjustly slapped across the face. This is merely just the beginning of Jesus' pain. This is merely a minuscule taste of the Jesus facing judgment, even though he's done nothing wrong. Jesus even points this out and tells this man and says, hey, what'd you do that for? They don't give him an answer. Instead, they keep him bound, and then they bring him to the current high priest, Joseph Caiaphas. Joseph Caiaphas. So the son-in-law. Caiaphas, we already know, wants Jesus dead. This has been a pre-plotted, pre-thought through thing. He wants Jesus dead. Some say that Caiaphas, that's his surname, means inquisitor. And so you could call him Joseph the Inquisitor. Keep in mind that the council that is formed is breaking the law right now. This is amazing. They capture Jesus at night, in the middle of the night, and they form a council at Caiaphas' house in the middle of the night. The Sanhedrin meeting is supposed to happen in the temple during the day, not during Passover week. They're literally breaking their own laws in regards to how this should be handled. Also, they're trying to give him capital punishment. And like I mentioned about being Passover week, that's something you cannot do during Passover. You cannot issue someone the death penalty during Passover week. So they're willing to break the laws in order to attempt to falsely accuse Jesus of somehow breaking the law. You see how kind of messed up this is? We're going to break the law so we can convict someone of breaking laws he hasn't broken. Jesus quite literally was going to go on to die as the just one for the unjust. So here we are, verse 53. I knew we'd get to the text eventually. Chapter 14, verse 53. Here we go. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, that's Caiaphas, And with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. That's to form the council, but the Sanhedrin. Verse 54. And Peter followed him afar off, even into the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. So even though everyone initially ran away when Jesus was arrested, Peter seems to be trying to keep his promise to never deny Jesus, to be his unashamed follower no matter what happens. And so we'll come back to what happens with him later. He's following at a distance. Another disciple that goes unnamed, some believe that it is John, actually gets to be inside the house. He had a connection to the high priest there, and they let him come inside. So the understanding is Peter's hiding out in the porch, or the courtyard, I should say. He's hiding in the courtyard. John had a connection to where he can actually be inside. Everybody ran, but now they're like, John and Peter are kind of hanging out. But that's all we know about the other disciple, John. We don't really know much more about that. But that's the eyewitness of what happened inside here. Verse 55. And the chief priests and all the council sought for a witness against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. Big surprise there. Verse 56. For many bear false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. Now this is important. In other words, for them to have the council they can't just make judgments. They have to get evidence first. They can only apply law based on the evidence brought forward. That's actually kind of how our judicial system works. We kind of got the idea from the past. Okay. And so they just need to find, but one witness doesn't work. You have to have collaborating witnesses. You have to have collaborating witnesses, right? And so they can't find a collaborating witness. They'll bring in one person, like, all right, find someone else, and they'll say something that isn't the same. They can't find those two witnesses to be the same. Verse 57, and there arose a certain and bear false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. So finally you get a couple of people to twist something Jesus said. And that is when he was talking about his physical body was going to be destroyed, and that in 3 days it would rise up again. And they're trying to make that an accusation that he was personally going to destroy the temple and then build it up in 3 days. They're trying to, but even then, when they found a couple of guys to kind of agree with that, verse 59, but neither so did their witness agree together. So no one's stories are lining up. Keep in mind, this was planned. We can also maybe assume that a lot of these witnesses are being paid off by the council member. Like, go in there and say something about Jesus. Because they'd have no reason to lie about Jesus unless it benefited them somehow. So you can assume there's some payoffs going on, like, hey, I'll say this in there. And even then, they can't get any of the witnesses to line up. So this is no surprise to us as Christians or as the reader here in Mark, that they can't find any truthful witness against Jesus. Keep in mind, this whole council, this whole judgment is a sham. They're breaking all the rules. They're breaking all the laws. They're not meeting in the right place or at the right time, and they're trying to make a judgment that they cannot make during Passover week. All of this is a sham. Yet even with all their planning, they could not find and collaborate enough evidence to condemn him. It's hard to find evidence that proves someone's guilt when they've never done or said anything wrong. You see, we live in a world today, we know we're all flawed, we all make mistakes. You can find dirt on anybody. It's politics season. Every single commercial is about dirt on somebody, and they probably all have a little bit of truth. Maybe some of them have a lot of truth, but it doesn't matter. Even if someone is genuinely a good person, if you get into politics, they'll find the one thing that no one will like about you, something you think you did in your past or something you did, right? Jesus never did anything wrong, so even when they tried to dig up dirt and make up stories, it couldn't work. It couldn't work. But Jesus is also fulfilling ancient prophecy in this moment. A prophecy written more than 700 years before. See, we've been reading through the book of Isaiah. And in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 53, which so clearly, that chapter, if you haven't read Isaiah 53 in the context of thinking it's talking about Jesus, read Isaiah 53 at some point. It so clearly prophesies about what Jesus would go through that it causes the most honest of skeptics to go, wait a second, this is awfully specific. Within this prophecy, it says in verse 9 that he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. So here he is in this trial, and they cannot find him to have said or done anything wrong, just like it says in Isaiah 53. Verse 60, and the high priest stood up in the midst. He's about had it, okay? No one's bringing the right evidence. He already wants to kill him. He already wants to if you will, in our modern context, he wants to put the gavel down, say guilty, and assign him the death penalty. He stands up in the midst and asks Jesus, saying, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus, it says that he held his peace and answered nothing. He just stands there and says nothing to all these false accusations. Jesus refused to respond to the false accusations. He was not going to give the false witness any credence. He was not going to play along with the ridiculous, foolish stories. He already told the father-in-law, Annas, get some real witnesses in here. Ask my disciples. They'll tell you what I said. And clearly they're not doing that. So Jesus is not playing their game. These men are fools. It almost makes me think that Jesus is using the wisdom of Proverbs 26:4, which says, answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. But Jesus is also once again fulfilling the prophecy from Isaiah 53. This is amazing. In verse 7 of Isaiah 53 it reads, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. Once again, written 700 years, over 700 years before this moment. Verse 61, again the high priest asked him and said unto him, art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Okay, things are getting real now, okay? This trial just took a very interesting take. They can't get any evidence, so the high priest does something he's not supposed to do. He's trying to get something to happen. In this context, blessed is a way of referencing God's name without saying his name. Okay? This is understood in the context. In fact, the other Gospels just say God there because they know it's referencing God. But according to Mark, he said blessed in place of God's name. But ironically, this high priest, think about this, this high priest who's doing an illegal trial, trying to convict someone of a crime they've not committed. He's literally breaking the 10 Commandments in bearing a false witness against him. In the moment, he's trying to treat God's name with reverence. Oh, I can't say God's name in court. I better just say Son of the Blessed. He's so wrapped up into his tradition idea that I got to be respectful of God's name, and yet he's not. This is literally the epitome of what Jesus has been dealing with this whole ministry with these people. It's like you say one thing, but you act another way. They're doing all these illegal activities and immoral things, and yet I'm going to be really respectful of God's name, though, Son of the Blessed. And yet he's about to condemn God's Son to death. This is great irony. According to Matthew chapter 26, in verse 63, the high priest invokes a legal oath. The high priest declared, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. This is a strong statement, especially used in the Sanhedrin. Hey, you're under oath before God. You got to tell me if these two statements are true. Are you the Messiah? And are you the Son of God? So Jesus, I want you to keep this in mind. Here we go. This is important. Jesus does not actually have to answer the question. He doesn't have to agree to this legal oath that he's imposing. But Jesus apparently accepts the oath and decides to respond to these questions. Jesus knows this response is what's going to be used against him. The high priest knows that Jesus has claimed to be both the Messiah and the Son of God. This is common knowledge. Like, there's no secret about that. Claiming to be the Son of God is a claim of being equal with God. This is what they're going to use to accuse him of blasphemy. Now, according to the law, and it's my understanding that they're still unfairly applying the law, and even this should not have warranted the death penalty. Because blasphemy that would have warranted the death penalty would be you saying something derogatory about God outright. Why be quiet about the false accusations and now respond to the thing that's actually going to get you killed? You see, the other accusations from those other people, they're all false accusations. But this accusation is true. It would seem that Jesus is using the wisdom of the second half of that proverb. So while it's true that you should answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him, you must also answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Jesus accepts the oath. He applies the wisdom. He does not hide from the truth. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus said, verse 62, I am. But Jesus does not just affirm that the statement is true. He has a few more words to say. I love this. He's been quiet this whole time. The last time he talked, he got slapped across the face. He's not addressing these false accusations. He's bound there before them. Finally, they say something that's actually true. He says, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. I don't know how much you understand this, but Jesus just dropped a hammer into this council like you would not believe. Jesus is referencing Psalm 110:1, and he's quoting Daniel 7:13. And these guys know their Hebrew Bible really well. Psalm 110:1 says, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. And Daniel chapter 7 verses 13 and 14 says this, the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. This direct reference that Jesus is clearly referencing, holy cow, man. In one brief answer to the high priest, Jesus unapologetically was declaring this, I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. I am your judge. I am the King of Kings. How do you think this is going to be handled? He clearly is implying to this high priest, right now I stand before you and you're judging me, but a day is quickly coming when I will judge you. And the people in this council will serve me. I am the Messiah. I am the Son of God. I am your judge. I am the King of Kings. Verse 63. Then the high priest rent his clothes and said, what? Need we any further witnesses? He's like, this is done. It's over. Got him to admit it. I got him to say it. Ye have heard the blasphemy. What think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. Once again, I already mentioned my understanding of the law is that Jesus could say that and that not be considered blasphemy worthy of death. And yet all 70 men on the council vote to condemn him. All of them. There's no excuse here. There's no getting around it. It's not like there was one holdout. It's not like it was 69-1. Like, no, they all agree to condemn him to be guilty of death. After he just warns them, you know that I'm your judge. I'm your king. You're going to serve me. Verse 65, it gets worse. Not only do they vote to condemn him to death, verse 65, and some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to buffet him and to say unto him, prophesy! And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. So they spit on him as an insult. To this day is still like one of the greatest forms of showing insult to someone, to spit on their face. Everyone knows what that means, and it's disgusting. And then someone either covers his eyes or blindfolds him or puts something over his face so he can't see. And then they start, the palms of their hand, smacking him, saying, huh, seeing as though you're a prophet, tell us who hit you. Someone wrote, a false witness will find ways to lie no matter the facts. A true witness will tell the truth no matter the consequences. See, meanwhile, as Jesus was being falsely accused, as Jesus was declaring who he was to the high priest, as Jesus was being spit on, beat on, and mocked, Peter's in the courtyard warming his hands by the fire. Verse 66, and as Peter was beneath in the palace, that he's in the courtyard below the palace, and there cometh one of the maids of the high priest. Verse 67, and when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him and said, and thou also was with Jesus of Nazareth. But he denied, saying, I know not, neither understand I what thou sayest. And he went out into the porch, and the cock crew. And the maid saw him again and began to say to them that stood by, this is one of them. And he denied it again. And a little after they stood by again, said again to Peter, surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. This is all happening kind of quickly right before and during and after this trial, is wait a second, you look like one of them? And not only that, you also sound like you're from Galilee. You can tell by your accent, by how you talk. You're also from the area Jesus is from. So they're kind of like putting the evidence together, like, oh yeah, this has totally got to be. But he again, verse 71, but he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not this man of whom ye speak. So you have Jesus on the inside saying, I am the Son of God. I am the Messiah. I am the High Judge. I am the King of Kings. And then you got Peter outside saying, I swear by God in heaven above, I don't know the blankety blank man. Quite the contrast of what's going on. Verse 72, and the second time the cock crew. And Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said to him before the cock crowed twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And when he thought thereon, he wept. He was so confident. Peter's always the most confident disciple in the group. He was so confident that something like this could never happen. He was trying so hard to be faithful and follow and defend Jesus. He was willing to fight for him. Then in one evening, with the strongest words, he denied Jesus. He allowed fear to control his thinking and his words. Now, we spent a good portion of time a couple of weeks ago explaining the difference between a Peter and a Judas, and that Judas was waiting for an opportunity to conveniently betray Jesus. Peter had a strong faith who, in a moment of fear, denied Jesus, and there's a significant difference. We're not going to talk about all that. If you didn't hear that, you can go online and look at that one from a couple weeks ago. But there's two quick applications about this. First, if you have been or are a Peter and have in some form or another denied Jesus out of fear, out of confusion, listen to the Holy Spirit, confess that to God, come back to Jesus. He knew you were going to slip up. Just like he knew Peter was going to slip up. But he loves you, wants you to come back home into his arms. Jesus loves Peter. Jesus is about to use Peter in an enormous way. So if you're someone who has in some form or another denied Jesus, if you truly love him and truly follow him, he wants you back. He wants you to repent. He already knew that you were going to slip up. Secondly, if you've been a Peter in the past, your past does not need to determine your future. God would go on to use Peter to proclaim the gospel to thousands. So many people who've made a mistake in their past think, oh man, I just can't do anything now. God can't use me anymore now. What God might use you for might be different than what you thought he was going to use you for. I understand that. The context of it might have to look different than maybe what you wanted it to be. I understand all of that. But all because you made a mistake in some way of denying Jesus out of fear and confusion. Don't think back on that past thing and think God can't use me now. He literally used Peter in a magnificent way and reached thousands with the gospel. The man who said, Jesus, oh, I swear by God, I don't know the blankety blank man. Peter repented, went back to the arms of Christ, went on to do great works for him. Don't let the past define what God can do with you. That's not up to you. Just trust God with it. And we're going to dive into the very first verse of chapter 15. It says, straightway in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation or a meeting with the elders and scribes and the whole council. Okay, what are they doing? So this is like, keep in mind, they were already in the middle of the night. It's really late. So like a few hours later, when the sun comes up, now they have the official meeting. Right? So this is, once again, they're trying to make sure they can get away with this. And it's like, you know what? The illegal meeting last night, we got to have another one. And they basically asked Jesus the same question to have him affirm it again so that they can make the official thing of it. But they wanted to make sure it was all in order. So this is like 5 or 6 in the morning. The sun was barely up probably. And they have this Sanhedrin meets together again really quick. So a few hours later, whatever it was, they take Jesus and do this again. So this can be the official time of judgment. And they keep Jesus bound, and they carry him away and deliver him to Pilate. Fulfilling the prophecy that he said would happen, that he'd be handed over to the Gentiles. So far, everything that he said would happen, it's happening. So an incredible amount of prophecy has been fulfilled in this chapter and the moments that we're going to come to. What we looked at today, here's some prophecy that was fulfilled. He's betrayed and handed over to the Sanhedrin. When falsely accused, he did not respond. They couldn't find any fault, could find him at fault for anything. Peter denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed twice, and he was delivered into the hands of the Romans. All those things are happening. Jesus is fulfilling prophecy that he himself declared just earlier, and fulfilling prophecy that had been declared over 700 years prior. Also, in these moments, Jesus has begun his humiliation and suffering. His hands are bound like a common criminal. He's slapped across the face for no reason. He's falsely accused of teaching things he did not say. He's condemned to death by an illegally assembled jury. And he's spit on, beaten, blindfolded, and mocked as he receives more